Okay, this video is going to start covering the aggregate. The first video will have to cover the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the ADAS model. And then it's going to specifically cover the aggregate demand curve in this model. Now, just a little bit of overview of the model. We call this aggregate demand, aggregate supply because it's going to be based on what we'll call aggregate output. Aggregate output, which is going to be the variable we'll put on the x-axis here, is like a quantity. But what we're thinking about here is this is the aggregate amount of output in the economy. So one way to think about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is the output can be like real GDP. So this is a model where we want to try to be able to give some insights on the determination of the level of real GDP in an economy. Because then this is also the model we'll use really sort of for business cycles, because business cycles involve a decline in that real GDP, the real amount of output. And real output would correspond to our standard of living, because again, if we're looking at what's happening in an economy at a given point in time, the population's fixed. So therefore, with a fixed population, as real output changes, then we'll have a change in output per capita, real GDP per capita, which is how we evaluate standards of living. So in a recession is a decline in real output in an economy. So this will give us a framework we can use to talk about what could possibly cause a recession, and then how possibly policy could be used to offset that decline in output, or maybe make a recession less worse than it could be, keep it from being a depression. So this is the framework. Is we're going to be looking at something called aggregate output, and we'll put that on the x-axis. The ADAS model, in effect, sort of applies our simple model of supply and demand that we had back in Chapter 3, that we introduced in Chapter 3 to help us understand the determination of price and output in, like, say, the market for peaches, for the market for one product, and we're trying to apply that same basic structure of a demand curve and a supply curve to understand not the amount of peaches, the amount of milk, or the amount of beef, but rather the overall level of output in the economy. And so when we're talking about the overall level of output in the economy, then what we really talk about, one reason why this model can make sense, or use this abstraction to this thing called aggregate output, is that we really don't care what's going on in the economy, whether how many houses are being produced versus how many how much clothing versus how many cars versus how much food. What we care about is the overall level of economic activity, and when that goes down, because that really sort of corresponds to what we think of it as a recession. Now, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, in one sense, then, is somewhat limited. There are some ways that some macroeconomists have tried to think about recessions that could involve something like a mismatch between what producers are producing and then the goods and services that consumers really want to consume. And in a model with aggregate output, we can't worry about that. We can't worry about, we have a slump in the economy because the economy is producing houses, but people would really rather have patio furniture being produced, or video games. And so the economy, in some sense, isn't producing the right goods. So the aggregate demand and aggregate supply doesn't allow us to look at that, but it does allow us to provide some kind of insight on a model that's relatively simple, that we sort of can borrow that supply and demand framework and look to provide some insight as to what's happening to the overall level of output in the economy. The supply and demand graph had price on the vertical axis. So again, we're not talking about the price of peaches here. We have this thing called aggregate output, but that's okay because aggregate output is really sort of like the price level. And so for macroeconomics, this is really kind of nice. And think of the price level as the level of the consumer price index in the economy. And then the aggregate output would be real GDP. So these are two macroeconomic variables, two of our big three variables that we talked about in chapters 6 and 8 respectively. And we're going to, in effect, put those on the axes here, and we're going to have a supply and demand diagram and model to talk about how we could get to an equilibrium. So the aggregate demand curve, it parallels what we talk about for like the demand for peaches, and so that would be the quantity of the good that people would want to buy at different prices. But here we have aggregate output, and so there's a little bit of a complication. We talk about the demand curve for peaches would be downward sloping or negatively sloped, and the reason we said that would be true is because of the law of demand. And the law of demand said that everything else equal, price and quantity would be inversely related. Now, that makes sense when you're talking about one good in isolation, because if the price of peaches goes up, people can buy something else. They could buy pears, they could buy apples, they could buy lettuce, and other things. A lot of other things you can buy other than the peaches or one good when you're looking at supply and demand. We have a little bit of an issue here because now we're talking about real output, and there's nothing else in the economy for people to buy. So at one level you might think, well, aren't people going to want to, you can't like simply, as the price of peaches go up, you buy pears instead. Well, you can't, as the price of real output goes up, buy something else instead. There's nothing else to buy. So for that reason, we can't rely on the same argument, the same thing of the law of demand to explain why the aggregate demand curve is going to slope downward. So we introduced 3 reasons, and they're described in chapter 13. There's a PowerPoint slide that has them on it. So the PowerPoint slide is called the slope of the aggregate demand curve. And the 3 reasons that we give there are called the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. I don't want, they then explain each of those. I don't want to go into too much, really any detail of those reasons. You do need to know, because it might be something we could ask on a quiz or an exam, why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. So you need to know these facts, and just in terms of the fact that it's not the law of demand, it's these wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and international trade effect that could explain it. But I don't even want to go into explaining them in detail, because these are some of the same factors that are going to be involved in terms of the overall level of the aggregate demand and then shifting the aggregate demand curve. And to my mind, it requires too much subtlety to try to explain like the difference between the international trade effect and how there could be some change in international trade that could shift the demand curve. So I don't want to do that, but you do need to know that there are 3 reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. They're different from the one we apply for the demand for peaches, but the end result is we're going to get an aggregate demand curve that looks just like that demand curve for peaches. It's going to be downward sloping. And the way to think about this is that at different price levels, it would be the different quantities of real output that people would end up wanting to purchase. So the demand curve, again, summarizes the behavior or the planned behavior of consumers in the economy. And so at lower levels, if output was cheaper, then people would want to buy more real output. They would want to buy more goods and services if the price level were truly lower. And so we can have that down. We're then going to talk about the chapter then talks about things that could shift the aggregate demand curve. But it's fairly easy to remember what these things could be, because the aggregate demand curve is simply C plus I plus G plus NX. We introduced that back in chapter 6 when we were talking about GDP and saying like these are sort of like the components of GDP. They're also the components of aggregate demand. And so when I said we introduced that in chapter 6, and I said it was worth memorizing. If you do have to memorize this, because it's not the kind of thing that you can necessarily easily intuitively remember. If you do have to memorize it, this is something that's worth memorizing, because this C plus I plus G plus NX give us the different components of aggregate demand. Remember, C is consumption, I is investment, G is government purchases of goods and services, and then NX is net exports. So anything that could increase one of these components of aggregate demand will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Will shift to the right. Anything that would cause one of these components to be smaller, again, at all price levels, so any kind of reduction in investment, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So aggregate demand can shift to the right. That would be an increase in aggregate demand. It can also shift to the left. And that would be a decrease in aggregate demand. And the chapter goes through a number of different factors that could lead to shifts in the aggregate demand curve. But if you think about each of those components, they're coming back to the C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, actually, C, I, and NX in this chapter. And then when we talk about government policy, we'll bring the G part in terms of fiscal policy. But the aggregate demand curve is sloping downwards. It ends up looking like the demand curve that we had in the supply and demand diagram, although there has to be a different reason. And we, as economists, we really like to be precise. So we insist on giving you the different reason as to why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward as opposed to the demand curve for peaches. But I don't want to dwell on those three reasons. Just know that that's a very easy question to ask. Like, why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward? And the answer would be those three different effects. The wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. But again, I don't even want to go into trying to explain those in any kind of detail, because they just cause confusion then when you're trying to talk about some of the same thing about like investment shifting the aggregate demand curve. And how is that different from the interest rate effect? I think it's causes some confusion. So there are three reasons why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. You need to know what those are, and that there are reasons there other than the law of demand. But then we'll focus just on like anything that can like increase the amount that consumers want to buy. The consumption component will shift things to the right. Investment is business investment, and business investment actually tends to be very variable, varies a lot over the business cycle. So many business cycle theories often bring in investment in an important way, because that's one of the components of GDP that varies a lot over the business cycle. So this is the aggregate demand curve. I'll have another video then to talk about the aggregate supply curves, and then we'll talk about equilibrium as well.